Okay. Good evening and welcome, everyone. You may have encountered some technical difficulties in reaching our program this evening. We are all back and ready to start and excited to welcome you to this very important event with my colleague, Tami Navarro. My name is Miriam Neptune, Senior Associate Director at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and I am excited to welcome you to a virtual gathering to celebrate the recent publication of the book Virgin Capital: Race, Gender, and Financialization in the U.S. Virgin Islands by Dr. Tami Navarro. We're so happy to have Tami here in conversation with Tamara Nopper. Before we start, I would also like to acknowledge that Barnard sits on the unceded land of the Lenape people, which is originally known as Lenape-Hoking. I also want to encourage you to learn more about BCRW events. We have an event coming up next week, December 9th, where we are going to continue our series with Dean Spade on building capacity for mutual aid groups. That's the third in our 4-event series, and you can register for it on our website. We encourage you to buy Tami Navarro's book, the book that we're discussing tonight. Please visit our book-selling partner, Word Up Community Bookshop at wordupbooks.com or your local independent bookstore. I want to give a big thanks to all of the BCRW staff, without whom fantastic programming and troubleshooting cannot happen. Everything at BCRW is possible because of the collaborative efforts of our staff, including Director Elizabeth Castelli, Program and Communications Manager Avi Cummings, Creative Director Hope Dector, Sophie Kreitzberg, our Post-Baccalaureate Fellow, Pam Phillips, our Senior Programs Assistant, and today we have BCRW Research Assistant Kelsey Kitsky working with us. We're very grateful as well for the dedicated talent and labor of our ASL interpreters, Trisha Vasquez and Yakata Nichols from Coco Language Advocacy. The live transcript is also available on the YouTube page, and live captions are being provided by Christine Garanco from Total Caption. We are running a little behind schedule, so I will try to quickly go through my introductions and then ask Tamara Nopper to join us to give opening remarks, after which we'll hear Tami reading from and presenting her book and a dialogue between her and Tamara. We will provide time for Q&A from the audience, so please add your questions to the comment area below the video. And now, finally, our talk begins with will take us on a journey to St. Croix from the unique perspective of an anthropologist with deep roots in the location she studies. As a Crucian with one foot in the mainland US, Tami Navarro provides deep insight into the ways that a financial scheme created to attract global investment to a small island economy exacerbates and relies upon familiar structures of racial capitalism. Navarro provides an eye-opening exploration of pressures that are placed on mainland educated and often light-skinned women working for mainland US-based companies in St. Croix that are taking advantage of the Neoliberal Economic Development Commission program. Through her interactions with the program's various players, Navarro vividly illustrates how, quote, in the EDC program, the long-standing hierarchies of race and color in the Caribbean merge with the neoliberal project of becoming an entrepreneur of the self to produce the figure of the EDC girl. Detailing the pressures that EDC girls face as consuming subjects in their communities as a kind of compensation for their privileged access to what is so-called easy money, Navarro paints a complicated picture of the ways that these women find agency and the ways in which locals in the U.S. Virgin Islands reconcile with the economic dependency and a longstanding dynamic many find reminiscent of, quote, slave days, a specter of the past quite visible in the present. It's a truly fascinating read, and I'm so excited to hear more from Tami and her interlocutor, Tamara Nopper. Quickly before I finish introducing our session, I really wanted to take a minute to just acknowledge how special this event is. It's special for me because it's my first chance to welcome Tami back to BCRW, where she was the most recent associate director. And as the person who is now in that role, I want to thank Tami for the formidable legacy she has left here at Barnard after 6 years. One significant reminder of Tami's impact is the physical presence of the I Am Queen Mary statue in Barnard Hall. This is the first thing you see as you enter one of the main buildings of the college campus. And the arrival and residency of Queen Mary is a direct outcome of Tami's transnational feminist work here at BCRW. It was enough that she brought the Crucian artist Levon Bell here as an artist in residence, but she didn't stop there. Tami worked to have this representation of Queen Mary Thomas, leader of an 1878 rebellion by plantation laborers in St. Croix, installed here at Barnard. This statue represents so much. She seriously and imposingly provides a beautiful visual sanctuary to many a young scholar who once did not see themselves visible on the in the aesthetics of this campus. And she makes tangible the silenced and hushed histories of the Atlantic, along with the resistance of Black women and the persistent resistance of Black women to both slavery and empire. I had to name this as one of many of Tami's accomplishments. Another important and notable thing that Tami did was to organize the legendary Hurston at 125 symposium in 2016, which brought together scholars in dialogue about Zora Neale Hurston's work as an anthropologist, and which I feel has particular significance tonight. Tami's work is definitely in the tradition of Zora in all the best ways. I have so much more that I would love to share. I'm conscious of time, but clearly I just want to share my admiration for you, Tami. We know how much you did here at Barnard, all while writing your book, and you are certainly a tough act to follow. I'm very inspired by your work. Thank you. Tami is official. I'm going to read a few more things from your official bio very quickly so everyone knows who you are. You're an assistant professor of Pan-African Studies at Drew University, a cultural anthropologist who has published work in journals such as Cultural Anthropology, American Anthropologist, and Small Axe Salon. You're also the co-host of Writing Home, American Voices from the Caribbean, which I'm excited we continue getting to work on together. And your book that we're celebrating tonight has been recognized by the Association for Feminist Anthropology. Congratulations, Tami. And I'm going to also quickly introduce Tamara Nopper, who in her own work thoughtfully weaves together an analysis of contemporary systems with a very deep sense of how history is showing up in the present. And so such a perfect match for this conversation. Dr. Knopper is a sociologist, writer, and editor. She's the editor of We Do This Till We Free Us, Abolitionist Organizing and Transforming Justice, a book of Miriam Kaba's writings and interviews. And we recommend that you purchase that book. Tamara, you are working on also, you're the writer and researcher for several data stories from Colin Kaepernick's Abolition for the People series, and a guest editor of the recently published Critical Sociology Forum, Race and Money, and obviously so much more. I want to welcome both of you to the virtual stage here at BCRW.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And I first want to just kind of briefly describe myself for the interpreters. I am Tamara Nopper, and I am East Asian. So I've got black hair, almond-shaped eyes, and they're brown. And I have very high cheekbones, which I like very much. So I'm going to go ahead with some introductory remarks. I would thank you for inviting me to be part of this. A few years back, I was in New York City to visit some people, and I decided to go to an event at the Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia University. And I went to the event partly to kind of say hello to Alondra Nelson, who was the director at the time, and also Vanessa Agar-Jones. And they were there discussing Tami's book and Tami's book in progress. And so that was when I was first introduced to Tami's research. So it's very exciting for me to be able to be here to kind of think about it with her now that it is published. And so I want to say, first of all, congratulations, Tami. And I also really enjoyed your book. So let me begin with my introductory remarks. In A Burst of Light and Other Essays, an account of her living with cancer, Audre Lorde concludes the epilogue with, I work, I love, I rest, I see and learn, and I report. These are my givens, not sureties, but a firm belief that whether or not living them with joy prolongs my life, it certainly enables me to pursue the objectives of that life with a deeper and more effective clarity. She dates the epilogue August 1987 and gives 3 locations: Carriacou, Grenada, Anguilla, British West Indies, and St. Croix, Virgin Islands. A few paragraphs before, Lorde describes her battle against cancer. I visualize daily winning the battles going on inside my body, and this is an important part of fighting for my life. In those visualizations, the cancer at times takes on the face and shape of my most implacable enemies, those I fight and resist most fiercely. Sometimes the wanton cells in my liver become Bull Connor and his police dogs completely smothered, rendered impotent in Birmingham, Alabama, by a mighty avalanche of young, determined Black marchers moving across him toward their future. P.W. Botha's bloated face of apartheid squashed into the earth beneath an onslaught of the slow, rhythmic advance of furious Blackness. Black South African women moving through my blood, destroying passbooks. Fireburn Mary, sweeping over the cruising countryside, axe and torch in hand. Lorde does not detail who Fireburn Mary is, but the mention of her is an inclusion of the Virgin Islands and her examples of Black diasporic rebellion, another instance of how Black women in particular figure in her freedom dreams. Fireburn Mary is Mary Thomas, one of the leaders of a labor and anti-police revolt in St. Croix in 1878, in which, for days, plantations and buildings were set on fire. At the request of the Danish government, U.S. troops stationed in Puerto Rico would violently put down the rebellion. Also known as Queen Mary, Thomas was one of several Black women, or queens, as they are politically praised, tried and incarcerated for their role in the rebellion. Lorde would live her last years in St. Croix with her partner, Gloria I. Joseph, Hampshire College professor, author, and co-founder, with Lorde and others, of the St. Croix Women's Coalition, which Lorde described as a counseling and advocacy community group focused upon domestic violence. In an interview with Callaloo Journal founder and editor Charles H. Roll, Lorde was asked why she moved to the U.S. Virgin Islands. Lorde responded, "Why did I come here? After 3 separate bouts with cancer, it became very clear to me that I had to change my environment, that I needed a situation where I could continue my work for as long as I was blessed to continue it, without having to face the pressures of New York. I need to live my life where stepping out each day was not like going to war. Not that we are not always involved in the war which continues. It will continue until we are all free. But on the level of locks on the door, dealing with subways, traffic, winter cold, shoveling snow, I no longer had the physical stamina to do that as well as my own work. These are some of the reasons I had to leave the Northeast. Coming to the U.S. Virgin Islands was a combination of many things. I was raised, Charles, in a West Indian household. My parents came from Barbados and Grenada. When asked by Roll to be more specific of how living in the Virgin Islands differs from living on the mainland, Lorde replied, as a Black woman, an African Caribbean American woman, there are certain realities of our battles here that are similar to those of many others who are part of the African diaspora. The U.S. Virgin Islands is part of the Caribbean. We are also, for better or ill, and for the most part ill, supposedly part of the United States. We are territory, which is a polite word for a colony. As the interview was conducted in the summer of 1990, the experience of Hurricane Hugo the year before and the arduous rebuilding efforts were preoccupations of Lorde's during her conversation. She discussed with Raul how mainlanders may have been aware of how the hurricane affected Black people on the mainland, but not so much those on the Virgin Islands. In doing so, she gestures at how fragile diasporic political bridges can be when, quote, Hurricane Hugo smashed the minor outlying islands, totally destroying the homes and livelihood of 66,000 people, when our communities were in upheaval, that was not of particular interest to Detroit, Chicago, California, and New York. And Black people in those places didn't realize that there are Black communities that were decimated. Now, you can say that one of the functions of this is to teach us a certain amount of humility. That may or may not be true. The point is, what happens on these islands is directly involved with what is going on with Black people on the mainland and all over the world. I'm speaking politically and economically as well as socially. For example, how many people are aware that on this tiny Caribbean island is the largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere, Hess Oil of the Virgin Islands? Dr. Tami Navarro's book, Virgin Capital, Race, Gender, and Financialization in the U.S. Virgin Islands, is not about Audre Lorde. Although the poet, the epigraph that opens the book, that Dr. Navarro opens the book with, is from Lorde. It's a line from her poem, Judith's Fancy, that appeared in Lorde's final volume of poetry titled The Marvelous Arithmetics of Distance. And I just think that title is just so powerful when we think about it. I first learned of that title of Lorde's book, The Marvelous Arithmetics of Distance, at the beginning of the pandemic last year. But through Dr. Navarro's examination of the Economic Development Commission, EDC, a development initiative established by the Virgin Islands government in 2001 that, quote, linked the economic fate of this 84 square mile island to financial developments on Wall Street, the Virgin Islands provides Virgin Capital provides a rich anthropology of finance, and in the process explores many of the themes that preoccupied Lorde. Questions about the relationship between slavery, colonialism, non-sovereignty, and in the current era, neoliberalism. How to think about time and history in relation to the present. Specifically, addressing concerns and accusations about the EDC that she heard from people who participated in her study, and some of these accusations included claims of the program being a return to slavery. Dr. Navarro writes, I attempt to capture the haunting of the EDC program, the palpable fear of the past wrongs reemerging in through the present with the phrase spectral time, a term that I use to gesture toward the fear and anticipation of violence, here anticipated as an economic and structural rather than necessarily physical threat. Dr. Navarro also considers how capitalism, and as she stresses in her book, Racial Capitalism, structures Black life and what role the state plays in both facilitating and regulating these capitalist institutions and processes. Additionally, Virgin Capital explores Black identity and diasporic understandings of Blackness as situated in relationship to the economy, geography, national boundaries, and notions of belonging home and being native. Finally, Virgin Capital considers the employment, literally and figuratively, of Black women in relation to the EDC program and how those dubbed, quote, EDC girls serve as stand-ins for both critics and proponents of the development initiative. Dr. Navarro accomplishes all of this by using as a point of departure some of the EDC's parameters, such as financial service companies being granted an exemption of 90% of U.S. federal income taxes if they relocate to the U.S. Virgin Islands, the residency requirement of living in the Virgin Islands 183 days a year, and the expectation to hire local workers, contract with local companies, and give to charitable causes. Ultimately, as an anthropology of finance, Dr. Navarro's Virgin Capital, Race, Gender, and Financialization in the U.S. Virgin Islands traces, as she puts it, quote, the effects of economic development on quotidian life. So I want to welcome Dr. Navarro, Tami Navarro, and to allow her to take the stage and share with her some excerpts of her new book.
Thank you so much for that, Tamara. That was amazing. Oh, I'm going to describe myself. I'm Tami Navarro. I'm an African-American woman. I have on a white top and a navy blazer. It's so wonderful to be here virtually among friends and colleagues. That introduction by Miriam Neptune, who is a dear friend and colleague with whom I get to work on some really wonderful projects, is amazing. And thank you, Tamara, for those comments. I think it's really interesting the way that you connect my work to that of Audre Lorde's, because of course, you know, for me, the connection is immediate. As will become apparent as this conversation goes along, I'm from St. Croix. And then so that was a big part of the kind of work that I had to do, the grappling that I had to do in writing this book, trying to sort of identify just for myself, my kind of anthropologist self and my Cruyssian self. But the epigraph, which I fought for, and many of you who have published work know the struggles of permissions, that took a long time, and I fought for that because that poem, Judith's Fancy, and the line that opens the book, it says, "Welcome, neighbor, I begin." And it's from the poem entitled Judith's Fancy, which is a kind of well-to-do middle to upper middle class neighborhood on St. Croix. And that poem is about Lord coming outside and meeting a new neighbor, a white woman and her young child, and the kind of anger that the young boy has towards her immediately, because he reads her as an employee. Instantly, as encountering her as a Black woman, he reads her as his would-be babysitter, which he didn't want, right? And so for me, that connection between race and color and gender and employment, or presumed employment, that connection was so clear to me that I thought that has to be the beginning of the book, because that's really what I'm looking at. I'm really looking at the ways in which these histories of race and gender and class, that nexus that we always talk about, but also informed by things like color, right? So the pigmentocracy that really kind of characterized life in the Caribbean, particularly the Anglophone and Hispanophone Caribbean, the ways that those histories inform present day economic possibilities. And so I thought that was a lovely bridge between Lord's work and writing and the book that I have produced. It's also worth mentioning that the Women's Coalition, which was co-founded by Lord and Gloria Joseph, among many others, was my very first job out of college. And it's where I really had some formative experiences in my activist and feminist consciousness. So thank you for that. That was lovely. I'm going to read two short-ish, in the interest of time, I hope short-ish excerpts from the book. Two of my primary theoretical interventions are what Tamara has introduced us to, the first being spectral time. And that's really my attempt to kind of find the language that will allow me to make sense of the theorization that was presented to me really by my informants on St. Croix. So when I would talk to Cruyssians, many Cruyssians, and say, you know, what are the ways that you see this EDC project impacting your life? How's it going? Is it improving your life? Do you see it having negative impacts? One of the first things that they would do was connect it instantly to slavery, right? They would jump over, you know, sort of centuries of development and paradigmatic shifts in development thinking, right? So it wasn't about industry. It wasn't about any of these moments that have come before, the kind of the way that St. Croix has largely been left out of tourist markets, for instance. None of that came into the conversation immediately. For so many of my informants, it was about slavery, right? So they would say slave days are over. And so I try to use this framing of spectral time, which I borrow from film theory, to talk about the ways that this current economic opportunity, this current economic happening, is not only informed by previous moments of racial capitalism, but for folks on the ground, is in fact an iteration of the same project, right? In fact, it's a sort of current manifestation of an ongoing project of dispossession of Black people. So the first section I'm going to read from is from the introduction, called Spectral Time. The question of time, of alternate temporalities that complicate a linear notion of time, has been the preoccupation of a number of scholars. Many have argued that the region is best apprehended through analyses that privilege temporality and capital. For those working in formerly colonized or post-colonial spaces, the interplay of past, present, and future has been of significance. For instance, Achille Mbembe has turned to the notion of entanglement to account for interlocking pasts, presents, and futures that inform life today in post-colonial African contexts. Caribbeanist scholars, too, have thought deeply about the implications or conceptions of time on both the present and the self, and have turned to any number of fields of study to address these questions. In The Repeating Island, Antonio Benitez Rojo enlists chaos theory to theorize the Caribbean as a space defined not by neat unfolding events, but rather a space that is perhaps best defined by fluidity and an unpredictable sameness. In her theorization of complex time, Deborah Thomas has turned to quantum physics. Citing Ella Shohat, M. Jackie Alexander has productively engaged the notion of palimpsestic time, where time is akin to, quote, a parchment that has been inscribed 2 or 3 times, the previous text having been imperfectly erased and remaining, therefore, still partly visible, end quote. All of this work does much to rightly foreground temporality and introduce alternate temporalities with which to think. For my work on the EDC program, the contributions of Anne Stoller are particularly useful, as she privileges unfolding anxieties vis-a-vis the past. For instance, in her work on complex time that is not neatly divided into past, then present, she argues rather that time is unpredictable and that contemporary life is often informed by unexpected realities, what she terms the uneven sedimentations of imperial rule. On this point, she writes, quote, "We need to do better to understand the nature of imperial duress, the anxieties and fears it produces, the potentialities it short circuits, the possibilities it enables, and the force it galvanizes to ensure that viable futures are not foreclosed," end quote. This emphasis on the anxieties that exist vis-a-vis nonlinear time is key to this project, yet it is not quite enough. Beyond anxiety around what might happen, that is, what awful outcome of the EDC program could be imagined given past experience, Crucians articulate a framing of time grounded in haunting. That is, while the EDC program is viewed skeptically on the island because of its public failures, like that of Stanford Financial and other EDC beneficiaries, this is not the only or even primary evidence Crucians marshal in their critique of the program. Instead, I argue, the positioning of this program as an attempt to return to, quote, slave days is rooted in an analysis that does not separate this instance of neoliberal development from earlier iterations of racialized wealth accumulation, such as slavery and colonialism. While advocates of the program dismiss the situating of the EDC in this trajectory as nonsense or misapprehension, I argue that this position is one that emerges from an experience of being haunted by the long history of racial capitalism in the region, what, borrowing from Bliss Kua Lim, I call spectral time. In a 2001 essay, Lim employs the phrase spectral time in a discussion of ghost films as historical allegory, writing, quote, "The ghostly return of traumatic events precisely troubles the boundaries of the past, present, and future, and cannot be written back into the complacency of a homogeneous empty time," end quote. This recognition of the present being not merely informed by the specter of the past, but rather being deeply interwoven with it, is a productive framing of the ways in which Crucians engage the EDC. In this way of seeing, it is not merely that wealthy white people have circuited through the Caribbean before and increased their wealth by doing so, although they certainly have. It is rather that this past is this present, or at the very least could be. That is, for Crucians whose response to the EDC program is, quote, slave days over, this neoliberal development program marks a desired attempt to reanimate a social and economic order rooted in their marginalization. This framing is also clearly tied to Avery Gordon's notion of ghostly matters that demand productive examination, as a central underlying premise of spectral time is that something, and here that something is the expendability of Black people under racial capitalism, something has gone terrifyingly awry, and not for the first time. So that's a bit on spectral time. And the other major intervention, building on the work of Cedric Robinson, is my use of racial capitalism. And so I'm going to read briefly from chapter 5, which is called Putting Race to Work, which talks about the way that race and color come to shape employment possibilities and life ways, really, in the USVI through the EDC program. On St. Croix, there are two competing interpretations of the EDC program. The first is that it is a quintessentially modern project, an attempt to situate this 84 square mile island as a new frontier in transnational financial processes. The second interpretation is that the initiative is a problematic refashioning of slavery, drawing on the politically dependent status of the USVI and pre-existing race, color, gender, and class hierarchies. This second assessment challenges the claims of newness in the first, but also points to the ways that longstanding hierarchies have become reinvigorated to influence and shape the trajectories of Crucians' lives. The critical reception of the EDC program that reflects Crucians' critique of capital in multiple registers as both a project of wealth consolidation, that is, a claim that the rich get richer through the program, and an insistence on engaging with the program through the lens of racial capitalism by centering the processes of racialization that facilitate these circuits. Contrary to the claims of its advocates, the EDC is neither an entirely virtual financial program demonstrative of a clean break with the island's racialized past, nor, as critics suggest, is an exact replica of white domination on the island in the model of slavery or colonialism. Rather, the EDC program is representative of a new moment of differently global processes and is an initiative that incorporates a formerly omitted island into global financial circulations while maintaining elements of race, color, class, and gender that are reminiscent of earlier processes in the region. This rendering points to the ways that financial markets are grounded in particular realities that reflect sedimented histories. This is what has always characterized the region, neither wholly old nor new. The EDC program is indicative of the current state of affairs in an international market in which financialization and neoliberal policies of freeing markets reign. While many new spaces have been opened, the relations on which these initiatives are based were established long ago, as they reproduce the race and color power dynamics seen since slavery. This means that my work is an examination of St. Croix as an emerging space vis-a-vis global financial processes. However, it is also a grounded analysis of the implications of this development program on the mostly women with whom I worked, as the Virgin Islanders whose lives have most been affected by this initiative, a focus that recenters conversations about global capital on the workers who make these processes possible. Thank you. I'm so excited for conversation, so I'll end it there.
Thank you. So Tami, you just mentioned that that you gained some of these insights by working with some of these women. Could you talk a little bit more about some of your methodology? And I was so curious about the fact that you were able to get these jobs.
Oh,
and so could you talk about that, but also think through maybe some of the color dynamics that your book talks quite a lot about and how you situated yourself in that conversation as well?
yeah. Thank you for that. I think I'll sort of going backwards and answer the second question first, only because the way I came, and I don't think I mentioned that in this book, but in earlier drafts I did, the way I came to this project was really circuitous. I was sort of casting about looking to get a job. I went back home after graduating with an anthropology degree as an undergraduate. And a number of my friends and people I had known sort of socially through high school said, you should really get one of those EDC jobs, right? And it was just tossed out there as sort of one of these easy to get, high paying positions that I would absolutely be offered. And I was, in fact, despite having no ability to decipher any kind of financial report at that time. I was offered a number of these positions and I thought, well, that's interesting, right? And so that began a series of conversations that really unearthed these hierarchies that I'm talking about, this kind of color privilege, the kind of insider networks of having gone to, quote, the right schools, right? Or having the absence of a detectable local accent, or these kind of circuits of mobility, in that a lot of these internships that would turn into full-time jobs were advertised by word of mouth, among sort of private school attendees. And I had known a bunch of these people socially growing up and in my educational history. And so that's sort of how I came to the program. I was because of the kind of embodied, the way I came to these interviews, I was offered a number of these positions, and I thought, well, that's not right. There's something there, right? There's something there that they're drawing on, because I knew a number of people who had gone either to the mainland or to the local university who were far more qualified than I was and couldn't even secure an interview, right? So it was clear to me that there was some kind of purchase with the way I was presented and why I was successful in getting these jobs. And a word on the method, I'm so glad you mentioned it, because often I still have the scare quotes around it because I feel uneasy. I still kind of have an investment in the objectivity of the anthropologist. But I went to, at that time, it was the St. Croix Economic Summit, and I was sort of just hanging around. I read extensively about my method because I think it's important for anthropologists and anthropology students in particular to understand that there's a whole world and a whole range of ways that people do things. So I talk about some of the cold calling. And one of the things that I did was I went and I kind of hung around the St. Croix Economic Summit and introduced myself around and tried to capitalize on my networks. And I met particularly managers from this new company that was coming in called Stanford Financial. And this would, in time, during my fieldwork, become the biggest kind of the most capital intensive and real estate intensive EDC beneficiary on St. Croix. And so he was buying up huge swaths of real estate. He was a billionaire from Texas. He had recently been ousted from Antigua. Jamaica Kincaid had sort of derided him. So he was a colorful character. And so I met managers from his outfit, and they said, you know what, you're from here. We're interested in talking to you more. Why don't you come down to the office next week? And it was a series of conversations through which I was very clear about, again, my positioning as an anthropologist. That was front and center. I said, I'd love to interview some of your employees. I'd love to interview you. And they said, well, that doesn't seem like enough. Why don't you come in and work with them as an unpaid intern a few times a week, which seemed then, and when you know the end of the story, seems now even crazier, because it turned out that the entire operation was a sham. It was a Ponzi scheme, and the namesake of that organization, Alan Stanford, is now in federal prison on the North mainland for over 100 years. So why they let me in, I don't know. But I think it had something to do with a kind of legibility, a kind of, it seems to me that I was maybe a buffer for them to the local community, because the kind of reception that they received was very surprising. A number of these EDC folks were really surprised by the kind of animosity that they faced, or the kind of confrontational ways in which Virgin Islanders engaged the program, and they just didn't get it. They thought, we're coming in to invest all this capital, all boats will rise, and so really the histories and the kind of the anxiety, their sort of racialized anxiety that they encountered was very off-putting to them. I mean, they read it as a real misapprehension. They just thought, you know what we need? We need somebody from here who can explain this better. And so, if I think back on why was I invited to be an unpaid intern, I think that's what it was. They were trying to sell the program and trying to sort of make it clear to Virgin Islanders why they weren't getting it. When, of course, I did the exact opposite. And what I gathered was a theorization that was grounded in long histories of dispossession. Yeah, but I think that method is really interesting. And I appreciate the opportunity to say I didn't work for any EDC company, but yeah, it was a real gift. It was a real gift to be able to spend, sort of unmonitored time with a lot of the employees in the lunchrooms and in these spaces that turned out to be really productive field sites.
Yeah, I thought it was so fascinating, especially because you were so upfront that I'm an anthropologist. I'm here to study you as an anthropologist. And you had these meetings with some higher ups, and not only in the companies, but also in the program itself. And because you got to work for some of the EDCs, but also, I forget the name of, but the organization that gave out that facilitated them, right? So you also got to see kind of the administrative side of that.
Yeah.
So I thought that was fascinating. And one thing is, when you're talking about kind of the anxiety, if we loop back to kind of your points about spectral time, you were saying that, it was also something that people who were running these EDCs, they were aware that there was this critique that it was like slavery, right? And so how did they respond to that a lot of times?
They thought it was madness. I mean, there was this kind of volley, and that's I think where the project really took off is a sort of, again, I was seen on both sides as a kind of buffer, as like a translator. Like please make these people understand that what they're doing is wrong.
Mhm.
And please make these people understand that we're here to improve their lives. We're the saviors of this economy, right? And so there was this volley really in all the local publications, in the newspapers, in, the internet 10 years ago was a different space than it is today, but in these sort of early sites, these websites where people were voicing their opinion, and they had, really kind of colorfully titled op-eds, kind of just tossing back and forth, you don't get it, you're just here to rip us off. And it was just a real crossfire of these positions. And for the folks on the EDC side, they truly just seemed baffled. And really, it was an affront for a lot of them that they were not more welcomed to the island, because the thought was, well, we could have shopped around and we could have taken our money anywhere. We could have gone to the Caymans, we could have, gone to Panama, but we came here. Why aren't you more grateful? And from the side of Crucians, they were saying, that's great, but it's not actually benefiting us to any degree that we can perceive. In fact, it's detrimental to us in that things like property taxes would quadruple. And there was, again, this sort of specter of the Virgin Islands is made up of 3 islands. I primarily did field work on the largest, St. Croix, but St. John is the smallest, and it is prohibitively expensive. And so many, even ancestral Virgin Islanders, cannot lay claim to having a home there or any kind of land purchase. And so there were all these fears about displacement, which just weren't sort of engaged by the EDC side. They just thought, well, this is crazy. If you just come in and interview, we'll give you a job. These jobs pay well. Just come on in. But they themselves were not, I don't know, they somehow were not actively engaging with their own practices of hiring and interviewing.
So one of the things that I thought was interesting was the way, because this is specifically financial services, and you had talked about how for the Virgin Islands, like tourism, unlike in other Caribbean countries, was not kind of the dominant kind of industry in the same way. So how did, on one hand, and what I thought was interesting too, is you're talking about financial services and kind of the particularity of this being the kind of imposed industry compared to, let's say, sweatshops or, and other stuff. But it's like, how did that play a role in kind of the elevated sense of these EDC girls, and kind of also some of the hostility that was particular towards them and expectations of them as consumers? You talked about there was a lot of pressure put on these Black women who did get these jobs, particularly at Stanford. So,
yes, I think their position, these EDC girls, as they're called, we're switching. They were in a really kind of ambivalent position. On the one hand, it was a really financially lucrative employment opportunity. And so I write about the fact that at that time, the average starting salary was in the mid like $65,000 or $66,000, which is far more. It's more than double the average, right? The average income in the VI, which is difficult when you're thinking about the fact that many of these young women were in their early to mid 20s. And so they were out earning their parents, their grandparents, and given kind of residential patterns in the Caribbean, many of these young women still lived at home that they had grown up with their parents. So they were out earning them, which raised all kinds of complicated questions around financial responsibilities. I'm 25 and paying the mortgage, and this wouldn't be the case if I wasn't in the EDC. And so questions about authority and just kind of community relations were really brought to the fore by the capital that was introduced by these EDC companies. And so they occupied this position of both being, admired is a strong word, recognized for their financial purchase. I would say that they were seen as a sort of space of access to this money, what is called EDC money, that if Crucians in particular could somehow appeal to these women and their individual paychecks, then they could access some of this EDC money that was otherwise unavailable to them. Because of the things that I talked about, they weren't able to sort of be part of these pre-existing networks. They weren't able to capitalize on the kind of color, linguistic mobility, preferences, right? These kinds of these spaces of power weren't open to them. But what was open to them were their neighbors or cousins or friends who became EDC employees. And so these women would be openly kind of chided and taunted, right? So I write about an anecdote. We're walking down the street and one guy says, hey, why don't you come in and spend up some of that money? I know you have extra. And so it's not even seen as their capital, their sort of money that they've earned, their salary. It's seen as somehow community money that they should like somehow spread around. So there was that. They were often approached for either money or loans or an opportunity to be introduced, to an EDC opportunity themselves. But they were also derided, right? They were seen as somehow selling out, right? Especially when a lot of these EDCs turned out to be farces. So Stanford, I write about, but it's certainly not the only one. There were a number of raids by the SEC, by the FBI. And so there was some derision there saying like, you sold us out. This program is really not for Virgin Islanders. And so they were in this really kind of awkward positioning of being pursued for the kinds of access to global wealth that they had, but also they still occupied a space as sort of community members. And so it's through that space that folks would try to appeal to the money, but it's also through that space that the kind of guilt would come through. And so you never kind of knew which one you were going to get. And what these women did, they were really nimble about their position, is in small ways, they would try to maybe remove the markers, right? So Stanford workers had this golden lapel pin. It seems like a small detail, except it was huge, right? And so people look for that. They would look for that in the supermarket and be like, oh, there's one, right? She's got money. And so they would remove that or change their clothes because there was a sort of formality to the dress that was really singular to that company, right? So it would be 90 degrees in August, and they would have on sort of stockings and closed-toed heels and a blazer. It made no sense for the temperature. And so they would try to sort of disguise the fact that they were affiliated with this sector so that they could sort of be part of they could just be themselves, and they weren't seen first and foremost as representatives of the EDC program, which was a heavy burden to bear.
Yeah, I mean, but it was also interesting because, like, speaking of the pin, you also noted that some of these employees, like, they would get treated better if they had the pin on, and like they would just get better service at restaurants and so forth. So there was also this way where it seemed like they kind of benefited in some of these small ways, but it does create this kind of, I think one of the bigger points you were raising in the book that I appreciated was you were saying kind of, what does it mean that these women become seen as kind of like these conduits to how other people get access to this institution because of these hiring practices? Because if it was supposed to be that you're supposed to hire so many people from the local community, or this is supposed to be an investment in the island, right? But it does build that pressure on them. Now, one of the things too that you talked a lot about some of the kind of hardening of kind of binary race thinking, even though Virgin Islands is multiracial, and multiracial also from other Caribbean islands, but also Black people from other Caribbean islands as well. And so you talked about this kind of determination to identify native Virgin Islanders. And I saw you, and I'm not trying to, press, but I noticed what you said, like people who are ancestral to the Virgin Islands. And so it seemed like you were even kind of negotiating that language yourself. But you raised in the book, what does it mean to kind of think about or create this idea of a native Virgin Islander in terms of the history of slavery and colonialism and still being an unincorporated territory of the United States? So could you speak about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's an ongoing saga. And all of these categories, so there's native, there's ancestral native, there's just ancestral. These are all actually were attempts at juridical categories of identification in the Virgin Islands. So for the past several decades, there have been these things called constitutional conventions, which are where Virgin Islanders get together and attempt to define their status, right, under exactly what you talk about. So given the umbrella, given the reality of existing as a colony, as Laura tells us, a polite way of saying a colony, being an unincorporated territory of the US, like neighbor Puerto Rico, how do we then, what it began as is really, how do we then establish this sort of spaces of exception or priority for people who can stake a claim to a particular date? And that got really slippery, right? Is it the date, the sale date when these islands were formerly Danish? And so in 1917, is it 1917, right, when they become American? Is that the moment? Is it 10 years later when the sort of fuller scope of rights and citizenship of being an American come into being? Is it something that's tied to emancipation? So there's this whole, what I'm trying to say is there's this whole ongoing to this present moment conversation around, yes, we're American, like we're subjects of the United States and its empire. We understand that. And yet we want to be able to create these sort of legal spaces of exception for folks who can stake this claim to the Virgin Islands in a kind of, which is so interesting, in a kind of linearity of time. Like there's a sort of pin drop of this is the moment. If you were here then you can have things like preferential employment access. So this really, in the mid-90s, this came up when casino gaming was introduced to the USVI, and saying, well, we're just going to get flooded with all these people who come in to work in this industry, take all the money and leave. And so the thought at that moment was, well, why don't we say that folks who are native or ancestral native or some combination of that, 10% of those folks have to make up the employment numbers in these industries, or land purchases. I talked about St. John. These are really small spaces. And so when these swaths of land get purchased, or the numbers start to balloon up, folks really do get displaced. And so there were questions and comparisons around things like the neighboring British Virgin Islands, which does have a legal category of belongers in relation to non-belongers. And they also occupy kind of quasi-sovereign. And there's also sort of questions of sovereignty there. And so all of it failed is the point of the story, right? There are attempts to carve out these spaces. And in these conversations, you really see the slippery slope of belonging, the slippery slope of what it is to be a Virgin Islander. So you talked about, Black people who have migrated from other Caribbean islands, who are in one breath, Crucians would describe to me as part of us, right? The us who is against the wealthy white them. Like it's a really easy story of like rich white terrible people and poor dispossessed Black people. And in the next breath, there's a finer grain to it. And they'll say, well, you know how they, so folks from Down Island who had maybe migrated from Antigua or from St. Lucia. So that the us and the them binary was really unstable. And I saw that through the Constitutional Convention that took place during the period of my fieldwork in 2008. But it was all rooted and continues to be rooted in a desire to determine who really belongs, right? Because the EDC, at the height in the mid-aughts, was a sort of flashpoint where folks were trying to decide what investment, in both registers, what financial investment and investment, as in this is your home, this is a space that you want to belong to more broadly. What does that look like? And what are the determinants of that investment? And EDC folks were seen as falling far short because they were just seen as wanting to come in. You talked about the 183 days, come in, land on the tarmac, that counts as a day, leave. That there were all these kind of circuitous ways that they wanted to benefit from the program. But the larger claim that Virgin Islanders were making was that you're not actually benefiting the territory or its people. And this is a story that we've seen before, and we're going to name that really clearly.
Yeah, the part about coming home, when I was reading your book, I was thinking a lot about, so I, studied neoliberalism and I teach about it, and in the context particularly of like immigrant urban labor in the United States. And a lot of that labor, again, is often talked about in the United States context as either a lot of times like domestic workers, or people who, and sometimes they'll talk about like nurses and teachers who come over in terms of like, and so forth. But I kept thinking about, how do we think about neoliberalism in relationship to people who are the descendants of formerly enslaved people? And this is something I've thought quite a lot about just like the way, and this goes back to your stuff about spectral time, but the way that we understand neoliberalism today, does it really deal with like slavery and colonialism, or is it kind of conceptually distinct in some ways? And so could you talk a little bit about how you grappled with that? I know you talked about it in terms of your study participants talking about it, but as an anthropologist studying it, how did you think through that?
Thanks for that question. I really, I see it again as a, not even a misrecognition, but an inability to engage or take up the realities in which you're dwelling, right? So for these EDC folks that would come in and say things like, we're not, they wouldn't say we're not racist, we're not biased, we're just looking for the right person for the job, right? That those kinds of throwaway statements are so loaded, right? With exactly the histories that you're pointing to, which are so, for anyone who studied them or lived them, immediately evident. I mean, even for, the theoreticians who are Crucians who just were sort of living, right? They knew instantly what that meant, right? The right kind of voice, the right kind of coloring, the right name, right, which maybe comes from the plantocracy. So it's immediately tied to these longer histories of slavery. And yet the sort of neoliberal focus on the individual kind of, I think that's why they were in such direct conflict, right? Because for Virgin Islanders, they're trying to do things like penetrate the individual paycheck, which is problematic in all kinds of ways, not first and foremost, the kind of gendered presumption, right, of things like Cynthia Enlow would talk about pin money and the expendability of women's paychecks. But they're trying to sort of argue for communal benefit, right, over and against the neoliberal ethos and emphasis on the individual. Like, it is this woman who has gotten this job, this is her paycheck to do as she pleases. And that comes into direct conflict with, no, this is a communal enterprise. Like, you are coming in here, we are bearing kind of we're suffering some of the kind of detrimental effects of this program communally. Like, we are going to sort of argue for a different approach, which is complicated on both sides, right? I don't think that it's certainly not an easy story to tell, but I think that emphasis on this individual person somehow rising to the top of their own accord is deeply flawed and problematic. We all know that. And tying it to these longer histories of why are they so easy to sort of be swept up into this global process? What are the specific moments? What are the specific linguistic preferences? What are the things that make them so perfect, right? To be, as we talked about earlier, that entrepreneur of the self. So I see them coexisting. I think that these things, as an anthropologist, I see them building upon each other, but being framed as somehow absent of any kind of history, which I think is really bizarre, actually.
And also, I was thinking, because you talked about how many of the women who became quote unquote EDC girls, they had been educated in the United States. And so that was also part of kind of how they got read differently because of the devaluation of the way that degrees earned in the Virgin Islands were devalued a lot of times. And so there's, as you know, like in kind of studies of neoliberalism, there's a lot of stuff about brain drains and will people leave and so forth. What does it mean? Like, obviously there's the physical leaving, but what does it mean to leave if your country is not sovereign and where you're kind of going to is still the country that possesses you? And so how does that differ from, let's say, how we think of brain drain a lot of times in neoliberal kind of research or research about neoliberalism?
Thank you. That's such a beautiful and deeply felt question, because that's exactly the language around the leaving, right? It is this sort of brain drain. And even now, it's so funny, you talked about me working at the regulatory agency, which is called the EDA, the Economic Development Authority, that was in charge of kind of doling out these benefits. The head of that at that time is now today the governor of the Virgin Islands, which is really interesting.
You have all these connections through this book.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know, a decade later, right, political ambitions would rear their head. But no, and so this is the language he uses today even. So there's, last week there began a program to combat brain drain, and we're losing some of our best and brightest to the States and to these, and it's primarily to the US, because when you think about the avenues of mobility, Virgin Islanders, they can't vote in federal elections, their taxes are completely regulated differently, but they have that blue passport, right? So they have the kind of access, which has been important during the pandemic. They have access to the mainland in ways that neighbors in the Caribbean simply don't, right? And so they themselves occupy a kind of ambivalent space of American but Caribbean, right? But the brain drain is described exactly like leaving for another country, right? It's this sort of investment. It's back to that native or ancestral space. So it's not a politically sovereign space, but there is a deep investment and claim to a kind of cultural specificity or sovereignty, if you will, so that there's something about being in the Virgin Islands that it's sort of like, yes, we understand that it's American. And they make much of that in their tourist campaign. So earlier you said that the VI wasn't, part of the sort of global tourist market in real ways, which is not so. St. Thomas appears on almost every cruise ship itinerary that you can find. St. John has a different niche as a luxury tourist market, but it's really St. Croix. And that's why, for me, there's a specificity of field work that's so important, because you can theorize the Virgin Islands as a sort of single entity, but then you miss so much of the nuance of the material differences that really shape lives and possibilities, right? So it's St. Croix that when the governor talks about things like we need to combat brain drain, that's the space where there's not as much economic opportunity. That's a space where the educational the degrees that people are earning at the local institution are not then sort of able to carry it over to any kind of industry that exists at present, particularly with the kind of steep decline of the EDC program that happened in the 2007-2008 moment, right? That sort of global financial contraction dried up a lot of this money, such that there's only a handful of these beneficiaries operating today. But yeah, it's exactly that language around you're going to a different place. So there really is a sort of notion of the mainland as this foreign space, but people do engage with that nimbly because government officials, tourism officials make a big deal about the U.S. flag, and that your money, particularly when you think about capital handling, your money will be safe here, right? We're not going to nationalize the banks. You're not going to sort of lose your investment. There's a lot of reliance on the language of law and order and American empire in that register. But when folks are leaving, when young people are leaving, there is a sort of clear demarcation of us. Again, it's that binary that keeps shifting of us being Virgin Islanders, living a very particular life, and that other space, which is the mainland.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. So someone asked, I think, related to kind of what you're talking about, is St. Croix less of a tourist market than the other Virgin Islands? You had addressed that a little bit, but is there anything else you'd like to say in response to that question?
No, I will say absolutely. Yeah, I think that there are, again, just speaking to the necessity of dwelling for extended periods of time in a space, that it's really easy to lump things even like the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico together and say these, or Guam, right? These unincorporated territories are like this or operate like this, either politically or through law or through fiscal regulations. And it's just not so, right? That the material realities are quite, they're wildly different even within a single territory. So a space like St. John, where a home can cost triple what it would on a space like St. Croix, land values, property tax values, and that translates into what? People's ability to live their lives, to find employment that makes their lives livable. And so, yeah, St. Croix has for a long time, there's a long history behind that, but for a long time been really left out of these kind of tourist circuits, which has led to a lot of bad feelings really between the islands and the residents of the islands. So there's a lot of competition between St. Croix and St. Thomas, which is a point that could be easily missed, right? If you sort of just sort of flying over and saying, okay, well, this is this territory as a single entity.
No, I that's one of the things I really appreciate about kind of deep study, and just the fact that you brought all that to bear, because there are these ways where sometimes people who are from outside these countries, but who have these kind of political critiques about imperialism or about colonialism, we don't always think about kind of that level of specificity. So now I think we'll close with one last question, then if you want to say anything at the end, but and this is a question from me, because I think we have mainly compliments in the comments for you, which is wonderful. Was there anything, what was the hardest part about writing the book in terms of like something you really grappled with in terms of what you were studying or that you wanted to kind of say?
That's such a great question. I think the hardest thing was feeling that I had the authority to be the person to tell this story. I knew that it was an important story. I knew that it needed to be told. And as a grad, this began as my dissertation, and it changed dramatically. The things that the sort of emphasis on racial capitalism and spectral time didn't exist in the version of that was the dissertation. I knew that Virgin Islanders needed this story told. I knew that it was a contribution to, anthropology of finance. And I knew that there was sort of critiques of neoliberal development. All of those things made sense to me, but I really felt hamstrung by my position as a Virgin Islander and an anthropologist. I don't think I can overstate the complexity of that, sort of coming into the sort of authorial voice of saying, this is important. This is what my interlocutors argued. And here's the theorization that they're articulating. That took a long time to find that voice. And I think a lot of grad students struggle with that. And it took relying on voices like Zora Neale Hurston, who had gone back after being trained by Franz Boas to her, native community, her home community in Florida. It took contemporary anthropologists like Donna Ian Davis writing about autoethnography and privileging the complexity of self, not just the sort of reflexivity that anthropologists have to engage in, but a sort of deep thinking about what does dwelling and deeply considering certain aspects of your positionality and how it impacts what you receive from the field, that was a valid sort of site of inquiry. That took a long time. I think that took a long time. And even in the second round of reviews before it went to publication as a manuscript, I was pushed on that. Like, you need to be more present. We need to hear more about you're talking about the pigmentocracy. How did you gain access to these circuits? What was put yourself more in this, which for a long time I worked to sort of remove myself from it. So it was very interesting to hear a demand for that on the side of the reviewers, but I think it made it a richer ethnography because it provides insight into how does somebody navigate this, because these folks, these EDC girls, are not sort of fumbling around. They're deftly navigating both these long histories and the community demands and the demands of their employers, and trying to make a better life for themselves, whatever that means for their definition. If it means leaving, if it means for some of them staying and opening a business, getting promoted within the sector, but they are unaware. I mean, they are aware of the kind of structures that are putting pressure on their lives. And so it took a while for me to sort of admit that I was doing the same, right? That I had the voice that could tell this important story.
Oh, well, I'm so glad you authorized yourself to be able to do it. So
yeah.
We have two really quick questions, and we probably want to get to them as quickly as possible so we're not kind of going over time too much here. One is, this is a great question. What has been the reaction from government actors? I was kind of curious about that too, because
I'll tell you next week. I'm going down to the Virgin Islands next week. All of my talks have been virtual in the mainland. I'm going down to VI next week, and I'm doing purposefully. I think anthropology. It's the case that anthropology has this interesting and long history of sort of the sort of white men going into this field with a translator and transcribing all these interviews, writing something that is inaccessible to their informants, and never the twain shall meet, right? And for me, it was really important. I have been in touch with my informants, interlocutors, friends, really over the past decade. And so I've shared this book with a number of them. I made a point to set up community forums on each of the 3 Virgin Islands next week. So I'll be there presenting it. I want to hear from folks because this is an ongoing story. So the EDC doesn't exist in the same format because a lot of the money, as I say, dried up in that financial contraction in the mid-2000s. But the folks that are still there are still sort of at it. So you talked earlier about the Hess Oil, which has become most recently Lime Tree Oil Refinery, which has had a whole host of infractions from the EPA. And it was up to a few months ago spewing unknown gases. And I mean, there's lawsuits going on, really terrible stuff. So it was closed by the EPA. And recently purchased last week by an unnamed group of investors. And just yesterday, it became public knowledge that the major investor is, surprise to no one, a major EDC beneficiary. And so the money is still around. And so for me, it's so important to go back and continue these conversations because it is a sort of continuation of this story. It seems different. It looks like a different industry, but in fact, it's not, right? And so Virgin Islanders are onto something when they talk about the sort of long history that continues to sort of manifest over time.
So one of the questions, but I think I want to make sure that we conclude. Do we have any more time? I want to make sure that we're fine. We can stand. Okay. So I just want to make sure out of respect for the translators and closed captioners. So, okay.
Yes.
So somebody asked where they can find the event you're hosting in the U.S. Virgin Islands next week. So that might be something that
I can share that. I'll share that with BCRW, who can make that available.
Awesome. And then a question came in from Janet Jacobson. Congratulations on the wonderful book. How you build on it. Where does your work go from here?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Jacobson. Janet is a wonderful friend and colleague, and actually participating in the working group that she co-led with Elizabeth Bernstein at Bcrw at Barnard, the Gender Justice and Neoliberalism's working group was one of the real spaces that allowed deep thinking for me to sort of dwell and think through these different manifestations of neoliberalism. As you know, Tamara, can appear so different in spaces like Mexico City or Singapore or St. Croix, but really the kind of underlying structural impulses are persistent over space and time. So thank you for that, Janet, and the space to think and to produce this book. Where it goes from here is my new project. The thing about writing a book is, for many people, it takes a long time. So I've been done with this work for a long time. For the last couple of years, I've been doing activist work with a number of colleagues, including Lavon Bell. They're creator of that sculpture, Queen Mary, that Miriam was talking about. So we have formed a collective, the Virgin Islands Studies Collective. It's a group of four black women. And one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to have these various pedagogical interventions. And so I've really become interested in early education, K through 12, learning materials in the Virgin Islands. And so we're trying to write a textbook for young Black kids in the VI.
Wow, this is awesome.
Yeah, so they have some, I didn't learn about anthropology until I was an undergrad in college. So just kind of making them aware of some of the tools that are at their disposal and some of the ways of thinking that they should be taken up or should have the opportunity to take up earlier. So I'm really interested in K through 12 education. Lavon's, I'm really interested in creating a virtual museum because a lot of our objects and our history was taken by Denmark illegally when they sold the islands to the US. So they're still held in Danish museums illegally. And so the four of us all have different kind of interventions or takes on what happens next, but we're really interested in pedagogical interventions right now.
That's wonderful. And we have some questions about, there are some people who are very interested in these forums next week. And so
are there a bunch of people from the VI on here? Maybe.
There's somebody who's saying they're in St. Croix.
Yep.
And someone wondered if they could attend the community forum virtually.
They're not, everything is virtual in the States. Somehow in the Virgin Islands, everything is in person. I don't think they have virtual offerings, but I'm trying to see if I can put it in the chat right now. I'd be happy to. Nope, I don't have that option. I'll share it with Bcrw and
they said that they'll put it in the YouTube thing. So, okay. So how about if I ask you a more positive question? I was thinking about it. I was like, I asked you what was the hardest thing. Then I was going to have that be the last question. I was like, how are you going to do that? Right? Like, so what was the most enjoyable thing about writing this book?
I think seeing it come together, because there was just so much labor for anyone who's written a book or a dissertation. There's so much material and data, and to see it go from the space where it's just note cards and index cards posted around my apartment to like mind mapping, like this could be a chapter, to what it is today, to really seeing what my informants were trying to say all along, right? The way that these interviews, my book is really, really privileges the voices of my informants. So there's a lot of ethnography. There are, Tamara, you've read it. There are long passages where people are sort of just meandering and thinking through these long histories. And I purposely included that. And there was a time where I was maybe pulling away from that, but I thought this book is really trying to privilege and prioritize the voices of Virgin Islanders and what they're saying in reaction to this industry that has sort of been thrust upon them. That should be reflected in my style of writing. And so I think that the most enjoyable thing was giving the book and the voices of my informants the space to say what they needed to say and seeing it come together, right? Seeing the ways that freedom of letting them take center stage and their articulations was actually the theory. The Spectral Time came from me sort of thinking through their anxieties and like, why slavery of all things? Like, why do you all keep saying this is slavery? Seeing it come together into what I hope is a coherent whole. That was really rewarding to me.
So how about if we close with, is there anything you would like to say about the book or what work you hope that the book does? Yeah,
I would say I hope that the book contributes to scholarship that, in an earlier moment, it was maybe globalization, and then we sort of moved to neoliberalism. But there's a long history of these kinds of development schemes all around the globe. And I hope the hope for this book is that it contributes to a structural analysis of these power dynamics across space, right? So for me and for folks in the VI, it's really interesting and important because there's a specificity of Virgin Islands history, but it goes beyond that. I really want this book to be part of a longer story about the ways that capital accumulation is predicated on race and expectations, back to that epigraph of Audre Lorde's Welcome Neighbor, right? That there are ways in which certain bodies that are raced and gendered and classed and colored are presumed to be positioned in particular ways in relation to capital. And if there's a sort of gift that I can imagine for this book, it's that it is a contribution to that story.
I just want to say too, and I won't spoil the final sentences, but I thought the end, I thought the epilogue was really lovely. And I loved the last couple of sentences. I read them a couple of times. I was like, and when I finished it, I was like, I found it very poetic.
Yeah.
So I'll say that. And so, I can't tell readers what to do, but, let yourself build towards the end. I'm afraid people now will go and I can't control you. You know what I mean? But I have to say the last couple of sentences were really pretty. So,
thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that. It's, when you have 10 years, you can write a good sentence.
So no, but it was a great book. I enjoyed reading it. For those who have joined with us tonight, I hope that you consider getting a copy of the book. I think it's a very serious contribution to the conversation about neoliberalism. And again, I think it really pushes us to think about race in a more specific way, and also about the relationships between colonialism, slavery, and neoliberalism today. So thank you, Dr. Navarro, very much. And thank you, Miriam. And I think Miriam is going to close us out here. And thank you to the ASL interpreters and the live closed captioners. So
thank you.
Yes, thank you again to all of the BCRW team behind the scenes and our interpretation team. Thank you for everyone who hung in with us during the technical difficulties. We appreciate your presence with us tonight, and we ask that you follow up by getting the book, Virgin Capital, and checking out our events and info about Tami's upcoming events on the website, bcrw.barnard.edu. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.